We all know the story of Crécy, how Longbowmen rained death down onto waves of French knights, but what if I told you that story might be wrong? What if I told you that the heroes were the English men-at-arms, not the Longbowmen? And what if it wasn't a static defense, but a series of well-timed charges? Above all, what if the French came close to snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, and that this version isn't just speculation, it's a version told by the survivors themselves? Today, we're going to examine this alternative theory for the Battle of Crécy, and I'll show you how it is supported by both contemporary chroniclers, as well as show how the battle would have progressed in this scenario. Before we begin, it's important to remember that the story of the Longbowmen only became popularized later in the Hundred Years' War, and was then amplified by the Tudors. It could be that this is a case where the longbow was blown out of proportion in order to create a national myth, rather like the rifle and the Minutemen of the American Revolution. But why would the French adopt a piece of English propaganda? I'll explain that in a little bit, but first let's go over the contemporary sources that support the idea for this alternative version of the battle, and there are a shocking number of them. Jean le Bel is one of the most important. He was a friend to Jean of Hainaut, who was close to King Philip during the Crécy campaign. Le Bel also is one of the few chroniclers who personally saw the Longbowmen in action against men-at-arms during the Weardale campaign. Writing about Crécy, Le Bel states that the Longbowmen routed the Genoese, who then retreat into the French men-at-arms. This created a confused entanglement that the Longbowmen continued to fire into. However, Le Bel makes it clear that at this point the Longbowmen's primary contribution was injuring horses, not the men-at-arms themselves. With the French knights and crossbowmen entangled less than 200 meters away, the Black Prince saw his opportunity and took it. Le Bel states that the Prince of Wales and his division advanced down the slope to attack the French. This attack by the Black Prince is also mentioned by the Italian chronicler Villani, the Chronique de Normandie, the Chronicle of Saint Omer, the Chronicle of Artois, and the Este Family Chronicle. Froissart also mentions an advance, though he only mentions the Welsh. This was possibly longbowmen, but more likely the 1,500 or so lightly armed spearmen. What's important to note is that this is a large number of contemporary or near-contemporary chronicles that all mention an English advance. All of them likely had access to primary sources, that is to say survivors of the battle, and at least two of them, Le Bel and the Chronique de Normandie, had experience with warfare. Of the rest, most were written within 5 years or less of the battle. This means it would be impossible for them to be tainted by future events such as Poitiers and Agincourt. None of them are English chronicles or accounts, meaning that they do not have a vested interest in burnishing the national legend of the Longbowmen, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Moreover, the Chronique de Normandie doesn't just mention the advance of the Black Prince. It also specifies that later in the battle, the English reserve launches a charge into the French flank to save Prince Edward from disaster. The Chronicle of the Counts of Flanders also mentions a flank charge by King Edward to aid the Black Prince. And it's in these accounts that the alternative version of the battle really starts to make sense. Here's how I can see things unfolding. Let me know in the comments section if you agree or disagree. The battle starts per the commonly accepted timeline. The Genoese are forced into action and routed by a hail of arrows from the Longbowmen. As they retreat, they run into the French men-at-arms, who are advancing too closely behind them. This creates a confused mass, as the crossbowmen and men-at-arms are blocking each other and neither can maneuver. The Longbowmen continue to shoot into this mass, creating even more confusion, especially by injuring the unarmored horses. And all of this is happening right in front of Prince Edward, the future Black Prince, who we know from later events was a young man obsessed with chivalry. He was a courageous fighter and did not hesitate to engage in the melee. After all, years later, he would sail to Calais with his father to fight in the streets against a French attack. Seeing the entanglement of men-at-arms and crossbowmen within easy striking distance of his division, it's not far-fetched to see this same prince, only younger and more impetuous, ordering the advance. It's also possible that due to crop fields and ridges on both sides of the Vallée des Clercs, he might not have realized the size of the French army. Whatever his reasons, the Black Prince's division would have swept down the hill in a disciplined mass, with the men-at-arms likely taking the lead, supported on the flanks by the archers and maybe the light spearmen. This would be in line with chroniclers who remarked on how disciplined the English were throughout the battle. Against such a cohesive, disciplined force, the French and Genoese would have stood little chance. The French are struggling to control their injured horses and trying to kick, hack, or push the Genoese out of the way, and the Genoese are probably just trying to escape. In this situation, the crossbowmen would have suffered particularly badly. Caught between the mounted French and the attacking English, they also lack any real tools for defense. They would have been either cut down by the rapidly advancing English or trampled beneath the horses of the French. With the crossbowmen slaughtered, the English would then turn to the French men-at-arms. Pressed between their comrades pushing from behind and the English attacking from the front, the horsemen would have no room to maneuver. Disordered by their entanglement with the Genoese, they'd be easy prey, and the English men-at-arms, archers, and even the Welsh would have a relatively easy time hauling them from the saddle and finishing them off on the ground. Indeed, Froissart alludes to this when he states that many nobles and knights met their ends at the hands of Englishmen wielding, quote, large knives. These weapons would either be thrust at the vulnerable areas of a mounted knight, such as the gaps in the groin or thigh area, or used to finish off a knight that was already on the ground. Truly a pretty bad way to go. With all of these factors considered, this easily explains why casualties of the French vanguard were so catastrophic. However, it also answers another commonly asked question about the Battle of Crécy. Have any of you ever wondered why the French kept charging uphill at the fortified English? I know that I have. This alternative narrative answers that question perfectly, since in this version the French aren't charging uphill at a fortified enemy, rather they're charging a portion of the English army that has overextended itself. As you can see from this map, an advance by the Black Prince may have destroyed a large part of the French vanguard, but it had left him dangerously exposed. He'd moved downhill from his defensive position. It was in a spot where his division would be a focus for French attacks. King Philip and his commanders probably saw this as an opportunity to turn defeat into victory. If they could kill or better yet capture the Prince of Wales, then the deaths of all the men-at-arms and Genoese would be justified. With their heir as a prisoner of war, the English would almost certainly be forced to negotiate and pay a crippling ransom. If this was the case, then the charges worked, as all accounts agree that the Black Prince was hard-pressed. Remember how Villani and others have the king sending some or all of the reserve to aid his son, and remember how the Chronique de Normandie specifies an attack on the French flank. Well, how does all that happen? Well, we could look at this modern reconstruction here and get a pretty good idea. First of all, it's important to understand that the River Mayu has some marshy land along its banks. Historians generally agree that the marshlands were much more pronounced during the Middle Ages. If this is true, then the French knights would almost certainly have veered away from the marshland. This would have caused them to focus their attacks more on the Black Prince's left flank. Here, we could see that a series of French charges concentrated on the Black Prince's left would start to turn his flank. This happens often in ancient and medieval warfare, where battle lines could rotate dramatically as fighting wore on. So what would that mean for our understanding of the battle? Well, assuming this happened, the Black Prince's situation would be dire. If the French turn his left flank, as this picture here shows, it would effectively separate his division from the rest of the English army. If this happened, he'd be trapped against the River Mayu with nowhere to flee. Surrounded and crushingly outnumbered, he'd almost certainly be either killed or captured. This would be a catastrophic defeat for the English. Faced with such a prospect, King Edward would almost certainly have sent some or all of the English reserve to aid his son. As we can see here, if the French were not careful, then by turning the Black Prince's flank, they'd be exposing their own flank to the English reserve. It's also possible that, due to the ridge the English were positioned on, the French were unaware of the size or presence of the English reserve force. Either way, the Chronique de Normandie and the Chronicles of the Counts of Flanders make it clear that the English reserve crashed into the French flank. Catching the French by surprise, they defeat the charge and send the French retreating again. This gives the Black Prince a crucial moment to reform. He either withdraws back to his old position as implied by some chroniclers, or he simply re-engages his line with the rest of the English army. I find it most likely that he'd withdraw, probably under the advice of the experienced Earls of Northampton and Warwick. From here, the French might launch another charge or two, and perhaps this is where King John of Bohemia's ill-fated death ride takes place, but by now, the field is a quagmire of churned-up mud from the men and horses fighting over it. It's also covered with the bodies of the injured and dead from those charges. In short, this is not a field that cavalry can charge across with a fair degree of success. In the face of these factors, as well as the reformed English line and approaching dark, Jean le Bel and others convinced King Philip to withdraw. The Battle of Crécy is over. But far from being the one-sided victory that the English portray, King Philip came within a hair's breadth of capturing or killing the Black Prince and snatching victory from defeat. This is certainly an intriguing possibility, and it is supported by a lot of those non-English chroniclers. But why don't the English tell the same story? Could this be medieval propaganda? And it certainly could have been. One of the things that many soldiers fear most is a weapon that can kill them from range with impunity. Can you think of any other examples? There are two that I can think of, both from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians touted first the Bayraktar drone and then the HIMARS system as devastatingly accurate weapons capable of penetrating Russian defenses and striking down Russians at will. Does that sound familiar at all? Well, it should, because it's very similar to what the English said about the longbow versus French knights. In many ways, this could be an early form of psychological warfare. But why would they do this? And, well, there's a few different benefits. First of all, it could strike fear into their enemies, especially younger French knights who have only heard the stories. Second, it was a useful way to encourage commoners, who were paid far less than men-at-arms, to serve in France, thereby ensuring a steady flow of cheap manpower, which was always important for often bankrupt medieval kings. Lastly, there's the matter of the Tudors that I mentioned earlier. The Tudors, up to the start of Henry VIII's reign, were very conscious of the fact that they were usurpers. They needed a way to bind not just the nobility, but also the commoners to their rule. What better way than to make the glorious victories of their ancestors a joint venture between commoners and king? The idea of the brave Longbowmen delivering victory to the glorious kings Edward III and Henry V are a perfect presentation of nobles and commoners striving together for victory. Presenting this glory of the nation as a joint venture between the rulers and the ruled is a trope that still survives to this day in many places. But why would the French accept this narrative? Wouldn't they want to debunk it quickly? From a purely tactical standpoint, the answer is yes. But remember that this is a society with a high emphasis on appearances and perception. If the French knights accepted this alternative theory, they would be admitting that dismounted English knights were able to beat mounted French knights. Many would see this as admitting that French knights were inferior. On the other hand, bows and crossbows were generally considered to be the weapons of commoners and cowards. It's often easier to blame a defeat on the enemy's cowardice or treachery than it is to admit your own failings. We see this a lot in military history. For example, British officers during the American Revolution would complain that the Americans skulked behind stone walls and trees. This was often used to justify defeats or setbacks, something along the lines of, "If only the cowardly colonials would fight us like men in the open field, then we would have won." Moreover, the French had less ability to write the narratives because some of the biggest victories went to the English. This is a typical example of the victors being able to write the history, because while the French won the conflict, 100 Years' War can really be divided into phases, and the English won the biggest victories in several of these key phases. Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt jump immediately to mind. Now, I'm not saying that the longbow wasn't an effective weapon. It most certainly was, otherwise the English would not have brought so many bowmen to France. However, what I'm saying is that its effectiveness was quite possibly blown out of proportion, especially early in the 100 Years' War. In fact, this alternative version of Crécy isn't even saying that the longbow couldn't have been decisive. It just wasn't given a chance because the English advanced into the melee first. Even so, the longbow played a critical role in routing the Genoese crossbowmen as well as injuring the horses of the French men-at-arms. But what do you guys think about this alternative battle theory? Was Crécy really won by arrows, or was it won by the courage and steel of the men-at-arms? Or, maybe, was it an example of combined arms delivering victory on a medieval battlefield? Let me know in the comment section below what you think. As always, I hope you enjoyed the content, and if you did, hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell so you don't miss future videos. With that said, take care until the next time.